On the 18th of Sivan, on the Hebrew calendar, the family of Melville Edelstein and the community of the Sydenham Highlands North Shul commemorate the anniversary of Melville Edelstein's untimely death on June 16, 1976. As is customary on this anniversary, the Kaddish prayer is recited, a sanctification of God's name and acknowledgement that even in one's sorrow, God runs the world and works for the good of mankind.
He was a very good sleeper and he didn't sleep the whole night. Up and down, and he was agitated. And I asked him what was wrong. And he said, nothing really. It's nothing to be concerned about. And I said, no, what's going on? And he said, I think there's going to be big trouble.
A long time coming, on June 16, 1976, the youth of Soweto took to the streets in peaceful protest to register their rejection of Bantu education and the forced implementation of Afrikaans as the medium of instruction. Police opened fire. Students were killed and wounded. The peaceful demonstration turned violent. South Africa was never the same again.
I was at home in Israel. My mother was visiting at the time. The telephone rang. I went to answer it, and it was my brother-in-law calling from East London, and he told me what had happened. I blurted out to my mother, "Melville is dead."
Melville Edelstein was a social worker who for some 18 years had been working closely with the community of Soweto. On the morning of June 16th, Dr. Edelstein was hosting the official opening of a branch of his sheltered workshop program in Orlando East. When the news of the protest reached the project, the ceremony was brought to a hurried end as dignitaries and workers were ferried out of the township.
They were all warned to leave, and then he suddenly thought he had a very good friend, Perit Jacques, who was in juvenile employment. And he began to panic. He thought, I wonder if she knows she's got to get out. And he drove back to see where she was, and that's when it all happened.
For Melville, it was a fatal decision.
I felt partly responsible, although I didn't know that he was coming to my office. But still, that was where he was killed.
A few hours later, news photographer Peter Magobane came across the riot police, standing over the disfigured remains of Dr. Edelstein's body. A crude sign lay on top of his body with the words, "Beware, Afrikaans is the most dangerous drug for our future."
They would not have killed him if they knew who he was. No, not at all. He was part of the community.
After the shooting, he was regarded the enemy. Why? Because it was the white apartheid regime, the white police officers, the white man's gun being turned on against innocent young people.
In the days that followed his tragic murder, the extent of Dr. Edelstein's philanthropic work, as well as his prophetic warnings to the government about the feelings of the black township youth, made headlines across the country. People from all walks of life came to his funeral to pay their respects.
I remember his son was there, and I remember his son looked so much like him. I wondered whether he would come, and I was pleased to see that he had come.
I went to the funeral and I went with my brother, and I can remember driving there with my brother, and we stopped to get petrol, which wasn't far from Alexandra, and I can remember there were a lot of people running around. It felt as if we were sort of on the outskirts of a riot or something.
And I got such a fright. I knew that he had a daughter and a son, but I'd never met them. And I saw this guy, a clone to Melville. It was a son.
Over the years that followed, Dr. Edelstein's family have had to work hard to find closure. For eldest daughter Janet, aged 12 at the time, her father was murdered a week before her bat mitzvah.
We used to walk to the synagogue every Saturday morning. So on our walk, I think it was about 2 weeks prior to that, I remember distinctly him saying, you know, if anything ever happens to me, you're the oldest in this family, and I hope that you'll be able to take a lot from me and all our walks and talks, look after your mom and your sister.
For the youngest daughter, Shana, her father was murdered the day before her 8th birthday.
The night before, which was June the 15th, would have been 2 days before my birthday. And I wanted wishbone earrings. And it was quite strange how he came to me with a little box, this little black box, and inside were these wishbone earrings, and said, you know, I want you to have them now. Why now? It was a very happy memory. It was all I wanted, you know.
The Negev, desert landscape on the southern border, home to Israel's founding father and first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. Torn between his love for Israel and his commitment to South Africa, Melville Edelstein spent some 18 years of his early adult life in a spiritual wilderness. During that time, he met with David and Paula Ben-Gurion here, an important milestone on his journey to self-discovery and finally self-fulfillment in his work with the community of Soweto.
I don't know what he was searching for. We all search for love in some way. He was very happy when he had this job in which he could express himself. Perhaps had he come to Israel, it wouldn't have worked out in quite the same way. Perhaps that was his destiny.
Melville Edelstein was born in King Williamstown in 1919. His parents were Nochem and Rose.
We were 4 in the family, 3 girls and a boy, and my relationship was with Melville, not with my 2 sisters, who were more conventional, shall we say. We had a special relationship. He wasn't one of the gang. He was a serious fellow. And he would tell me about, for example, what was happening with Mussolini in Abyssinia. And I was also sort of caught up with it, inspired by his words. His hobbies were ideas, what was happening politically. My parents were Russian Jews. My father had come from Lithuania and my mother from Latvia.
Immigration to South Africa from Russia in the 1890s was via London. The London East End of the time was a vibrant Jewish immigrant community. It also served as a transit center for many refugees fleeing persecution in Latvia and Lithuania.
I did meet Rose, and she was quite a little tough lady, tiny little thing. I was a little bit nervous of her.
He was a very serious person. He was obviously a capable person. He ran a business and did very well.
They were very different in temperament. He was a thinker. He was introverted. He was dutiful.
The Jews who came from Eastern Russia in those days to South Africa must have been exceptionally resilient people because they were young, 16, 18 years of age, only spoke one language, and that was Yiddish.
Fleeing persecution in Russia, the refugees arrived via London in Cape Town in 1896. From here, the families of Nochem and Rose made their way up to King Williamstown.
We were not exactly religious, but traditional. It meant more to my father than my mother. My grandfather had been a rabbi. My grandfather actually established the first mikveh in King Williamstown, so I guess it meant a great deal to him.
Growing up in King Williamstown, Melville went to boarding school at Grey College in Port Elizabeth. By the time he finished high school, the Edelstein family had settled in East London, where Nochem built up a solid and successful wholesale business in Edelstein and Company.
From the time that he left school, he had a very troubled time because that was the time of decision. His father wanted him to come into the business, and he knew that wasn't his path and that he had to find his own. But it's in a way ironic because in a sense, Melville was getting away from his father, but he became his father. And all that liberalism and his depth, it all came from our father and from the home we grew up in. My father was very interested in abstract things such as justice, injustice. We had publications from Race Relations Institute in the house, and the content was an analysis of the position of the blacks and the whites in South Africa. And of course the conclusion was that there was a huge injustice being done here. So that's how I know it came from our father. The search for righteousness, you can say, that Melville had, perhaps also.
With 1939 came World War II. Aged 20, Melville did not sign up for active service, but went abroad and studied psychology at Edinburgh University. It was here that he met and married his first wife, Isabel Green. Together they had 2 children, a son Michael and daughter Vivian.
They met, I believe, in London. My dad was over there studying. They were both unconventional, and that was probably the attraction.
Isabel's father was Professor of Languages at the University of Edinburgh. He was also a military man, with a proud record of service in both world wars. In contrast, Melville had declared himself a pacifist.
The problems that the family had, my aunt tells me, with my father wasn't to do with him being Jewish. It was because he didn't go to war. And in their world, that meant that you were a coward.
In 1950, Melville and Isabel returned to South Africa with their baby son, Michael. By the time Vivian was born, their marriage was in trouble, and Melville and Isabel separated. Torn between South Africa and his feelings for Israel, still searching, in 1954, Melville worked his passage as a deckhand on a Dutch ship back to the Middle East. Returning to Israel, he traveled down south to the Negev and the kibbutz at Sde-Boker. It was here that he met and engaged with David Ben-Gurion and his wife, Paula.
He was doing these out-of-the-way things, and when people asked me, how's Melville, it wasn't what I wanted to say. I didn't want to say that he's on a ship and I don't know what he's doing. Ben-Gurion's wife, Paula, was known to be a very friendly person. And one morning at breakfast, Melville began to tell her something about his life story. I don't know what to do. I'd like to live in Israel. Israel has meaning for me. But on the other hand, I owe it to my other daughter and my son to be in South Africa. So what shall I do? I'm very unhappy. Paula said, my dear child, the bluebird of happiness is in your back garden.
In spite of Paula's perceptive advice, Melville found it difficult to accept that his destiny lay in South Africa and not in Israel. In 1956, Melville and Isabel were divorced. Melville was devastated, and a year later had a complete mental breakdown and admitted himself to Tara, a psychiatric institution in Johannesburg.
I remember visiting him there in Tara. He was quite happy there. And when he came out, I think he was much better.
Seemingly, it was during his time in Tara that Melville finally realized that the bluebird of happiness was indeed to be found not in Israel, but in his back garden in Soweto, South Africa.
He told me that one day he woke up and he said to himself, this is no good. I have children, I have to get out, I have to start again.
I was working for the welfare section of the old Non-European Affairs Department, which fell under the city of Johannesburg, and he joined that section towards the end of 58 or maybe 59. I must tell you that after some time Melville became deputy head of the whole section, which included not only welfare but recreation, sports, arts, all sorts of things.
He was very happy when he had this job in which he could express himself. Nobody who didn't care about what he was doing could have done so much and so well. So in that respect, he certainly found himself.
But on the domestic front, the consequences of Melville's divorce with Isabel led to an irreconcilable showdown with his son, Michael.
I believe that my father tried to make my brother choose between my mother and my dad. And this led to huge, huge anger in my brother. And my brother's character, he's intensely loyal. And so I just think it must have been absolutely devastating for him. The thought of being asked to choose against my mother.
Michael never forgave his father. In a final act of rejection, when he came of age, Michael legally changed his surname, adopting that of his mother Isabel's second husband, Lyle. From then on to Melville's dying day, Michael never saw or spoke to his father again. Living with her mother Isabel, Vivian, from age 5, found herself subjected to the hurt and confusion caused by the prejudice and racism inherent in the world around her.
When I started school, I didn't understand what was going on. I was going to a convent. My mother, and she said, well, you can't have that name. She said that all the children would tease me because it was a Jewish name. So that school, I used her maiden name, and then by the time I got to high school, I then used my stepfather's name, which also wasn't really my name. And, you know, it caused problems because everybody knew me under these different names. So what I think it did to me, I mean, what I do know is that I was very ashamed about being half Jewish. And I wouldn't tell anyone except for my very, very closest friends. And it was difficult because I was sort of pretending that I was something that I wasn't, trying to hide something that I was.
Fulfilled in his community work in Soweto, but somewhat bruised on the domestic front, finally in 1962, Melville's search for complete fulfillment came to a happy conclusion when he met and married his second wife, Rona.
Fantastic. Rona had nothing but a good influence on my father. And they had a stable and a loving home. She was fantastic.
Oh, I was very happy. I was very happy and I loved Rona. Her attitude to Melville was, listen, there's nothing wrong with you. There never was, forget about it. And I think that was great.
Melville and I met through my late sister. She actually worked for him. And that's how I met him. And we just clicked straight away. And I think about 6 months after that, we were married. He was very gentle and well-spoken, cultured, and we had a lot in common. We were friends. We were really best friends. He discussed everything with me.
One of many oppressive apartheid laws affecting black communities in the 1970s was influx control. Past laws determined the right of blacks to live in townships. Children required special school passes to be able to accompany their parents and attend township schools. Melville's office was responsible for school passes in the central west Jabavu area of Soweto.
The area in which I stayed was very close to the administration office where Mr. Edelstein used to work. And as youngsters, we came to know him as a father figure, very much concerned about the well-being and the welfare of children.
The system was harsh. Any black child found without a school pass would be arrested.
You'll make it a point that no one goes to jail because he did not have a school pass. He was passionate about the youth and their education. That every youth around that comes across him is assisted to get the school pass and ensure that he's at school.
But serving humanity in Soweto did not exactly earn Melville praise or promotion by his employers.
Melville was never considered for the post of head of that department. I think we were doing more than they wanted for the community. I spent most of my time trying to get youngsters fixed up, and not only youngsters, because I handled anybody who came along who'd been refused entry, and I tried to get them fixed up. and allowed into Johannesburg. It was a tough job fighting the influx control.
To me, he must have chosen that particular path quite carefully. And I've thought that maybe it was because maybe he thought about the parallels between Jewishness and being black, in that the laws that there used to be against Jews, we had the same laws here against blacks. And there were huge similarities. And so I think that he probably must have thought about that. And I'm proud of him for making that choice, because in those days you could live in your little white world and pretend that none of that was happening. It was very easy to do, and that's what most people did.
Another of Melville's priorities was job creation, especially for the youth and the disabled.
Dr. Edelstein was placing young people in jobs. He used to understand, as a social worker, the young mind, and he used to communicate with them at a level where they understood that they were understood. Obviously, an idle mind is a devil's workshop. So him placing them in jobs that could give them money and fulfill some of their dreams and keep them occupied. He used to be an important asset in the community.
In some instances, he was a little bit of a workaholic, and he worked in so many different places, never for one organization or for one cause.
At Arcadia, the South African Jewish orphanage in Parktown, Melville worked as volunteer social worker on the aftercare committee. This committee looked after the interests of young adults once they had left Arcadia at age 18 to find their way in the outside world.
I knew Dr. Edelstein pretty well. He used to go and see the children who had just left, to see that they had settled into their lives, into their jobs, into their studies, or whatever they were doing. He used to come and knock on the door. "Hello, it's Dr. Edelstein here," with his big glasses and always smiling and everything else. And he was a very gentle guy, Dr. Edelstein, and very quietly spoken, not forceful or anything like that. And I've just come to see if you're okay and if you need anything and how's it going.
In 1968, the year that Shana, his youngest daughter, was born, Melville started Club Hatikva to help young adults leaving the Ark, as it became known, to integrate socially into broader society and meet new friends.
People who were finding it difficult to meet new friends or to socialize or anything like that, Dr. Edelstein got them involved into Club Hatikva. And it grew into something that people used to look forward to, just to socialize, to get together. He was very helpful and he was a good guy.
Working with the black community so closely, he realized that there were major problems. And he then approached the Morris Isaacson School, and the matriculants were very eager to assist. He wanted to do a thesis on their grievances. What do young Africans think?
In 1971, Melville was awarded his MA for his research project into the attitudes of young urban blacks living in Soweto, which was titled, "What Do Young Africans Think?" Ironically, although they did not act upon his findings, Melville's work caught the interest of the Nationalist Party government. They requested him to do a similar study on the coloured youth. In 1972, Melville Edelstein received his doctorate from Pretoria University for his thesis on the attitudes of the coloured youth in South Africa.
On a Friday night and Saturday all day there was no work. He focused on his family and on downtime and just connecting to who he was. I honestly believe that his connection to the Torah and his study of Torah and Kabbalah connected him to himself.
When we got married, he wasn't religious. He started reading Jewish philosophy, and gradually he got into it completely. And he didn't drive on Shabbat. He wouldn't go out on Friday nights or Saturdays. He only ate at home. If he did go out, it was because of me, and he wouldn't eat. I kept a kosher home. I was not religious, but he never imposed it on me.
I used to conduct a class on Thursday night, a Talmud class, and this was our first introduction. He was very quiet, very gentle and very kind. And must be that he was intellectual. But subsequently, he one day asked me, will I teach him how to put on tefillin? Now, tefillin is what every male put on every day except Shabbat, Saturdays, and festivals. And he came to my flat on one Sunday morning, and I had to refresh his knowledge how to put on the tefillin. So I can imagine that he had an awakening of religious feeling, which came out in different ways.
He loved the Friday night ritual, loved ritual, the Sabbath, singing of the Sabbath.
Evident in both Melville Edelstein's personal life as well as his academic work was a deep spirituality, coupled with an underlying concern for humanity and mankind. Melville's Hebrew name was Menachem, which in English means a comfort. In the foreword to his thesis on the attitudes of black youth, Melville quotes a chapter from Jeremiah headed, "And seek the peace of the city."
Jeremiah, he says, seek the peace of the city where you live, because without peace, then there is no life. I see it a little bit even deeper, because he understood that God created man in his image of God. And he applied this to every human being, especially when he was, I suppose, very perturbed by the underprivileged people in Soweto.
In 1974, What Do Young Africans Think was republished by the Labour and Community Consultants Press. Interviewed in the Star newspaper at the time, Melville Edelstein commented, "Black hostility towards whites has not yet reached the point of no return in South Africa." In a prophetic observation that foreshadowed the circumstances of his own murder, he warned, "I must emphasize this social distance test was not necessarily a clear-cut reaction to actual people, but rather to their image."
The categorization of citizens according to color, we understood that there's a system that sought to create these artificial divisions between people, and in fact, some of the results of it are manifested through events such as the tragic killing of Dr. Edelstein on the day.
Indeed, it was now 1974, some 26 years since the implementation of the system of apartheid. As reflected in Dr. Edelstein's newspaper interview, the system of apartheid had by now successfully socialized the South African psyche into appraising people not as individuals with different personalities and characteristics, but characterized only according to a stereotypical image, determined solely by the color of their skin.
I grew up as a Christian, and I knew that as a human being, our primary relationship is with God, and therefore in the way in which we interact as human beings on earth, we had to, in fact, find ways of ensuring that we accommodate each other.
Just 6 weeks before the fatal day of June 16, 1976, then Dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg, Desmond Tutu, wrote in a letter to Prime Minister John Foster, "I am writing to you, sir, because I have a growing nightmarish fear that unless something drastic is done very soon, then bloodshed and violence are going to happen in South Africa almost inevitably. I am frightened, dreadfully frightened," Tutu continued in his letter, "that we may soon reach a point of no return, when events will generate a momentum of their own, when nothing will stop their reaching bloody denouement, which is too ghastly to contemplate."
I went to the township at about 5 in the morning. At the police station, I waited there to see what was happening. Any movement I followed. Police were being driven in, soldiers as well.
The plan for the day was a simple one in that we planned to organize ourselves and march towards the school that had been longest on boycott, that is Orlando West Junior Secondary School. We were not planning trouble. We were just planning to go and march, sing songs, raise our placards, and thereafter go back, to our respective homes.
Things were happening all over the show now. And I was stopped by the police who wanted to take my camera. I said, "No, why do you want to take my camera? Here's my press card." They said, "You're making yourself a nuisance. We don't want pictures taken here. If you don't move out of here, we're going to kill you." All right. I said, "Thank you." Got into the car. I drove around. I parked my car elsewhere, came back again, and followed whatever was happening.
Everything went according to plan. And by 11 a.m., the main columns of marchers had arrived from the far north and far west, and we had all congregated at Orlando West. Then the police arrived. And when the police arrived, then tension escalated, and it just got out of control when the police started charging at us. They then set a dog upon us, and then the dog was then killed, and then the rest, as they say, is history.
When I went to the Clyde office, I got a message that Melville had said I must on no account go back to my office. That was all it said. All the whites who were working at that office left in a great hurry. So I did too, and I went out through Dobsonville.
We're facing the police up on the hill. One of the student columns that had arrived much later than the rest, they approached from behind the police column, and the police panicked. There was a huge column of students approaching from behind them. So they then had to force their way through us. And as they were driving out in panic, they were shooting their way through the crowd, and that's how Hector Peterson was then shot.
He then heard what had happened with the crowd of youngsters and the police shooting a whole lot of them, and heard that they were marching back to Morris Isaacson, and he thought he should come to warn me.
It was a fatal decision. Perrette had long left, and the seething crowd were approaching.
I was told by Tlotling, the social worker, that when they realized that the crowd were coming up to Morris Isaacson, they locked my office door and hid under the desk. When the crowd got there, they broke open the door and hauled Melville out and killed him.
That was the first body I came across. I didn't know who the person was. I just got there and took pictures. It was afterwards that people started talking that this is Dr. Edelstein.
It was a very normal day at school. I was preparing for my bat mitzvah, and I was supposed to be going with my mother to the tailor, so I was having my dress made.
We went, had the fittings, and everything was very, very quiet. And then as we approached the house, we saw all these cars. And I said, I wonder what these cars are here for. And I drove into the driveway, and my sister was there, And she said, "Where have you been? We've been trying to get hold of you." Of course, we never had cell phones. And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Melville's been hurt in an accident." And then the phone rang, and I said to Janet, "Answer the phone."
It was a reporter from the Daily Mail. And they asked, "Where's your mom? Can we speak to her?"
And she said, "I'm just phoning about Dr. Edelstein." So I said, "Well, what about him?" She said she could hear that I knew nothing at that stage. She said, "No, he's been hurt." And then she put the phone down. And the next thing, these two men in black suits, I'll never forget this. And I think it was Marnie Mulder. And I can't remember which politician the next one was. And I opened the door and I just looked at them and I knew. And I said, "He's dead, isn't he?" And they said yes. And then I don't know. It was very, very hard.
We didn't know that it was Dr. Edelstein. We only came to know of it the following day.
At the time of Melville's death, Murphy Morobi was at Baragwanath Hospital, dealing with the horror and trauma of the many students wounded in the police shootings.
It just got worse as the day got on, because the news is reaching town, the various workplaces, that kids are being shot in the township. And the parents came back into a situation that was just marked by fires and flames and smoke throughout the township.
When we were rushed home, my husband told me, because he was in the thick of things, "You know what? Soweto is on fire." And the fire never stopped for days on end.
I don't know how I survived, but I survived. My nose was fractured in Alexander the next day on the 17th. I was hit with a baton. Policeman saying, "Take out your films from your camera." I said, "No," he hit me with a baton. I fell to the ground, I got up. I took out the film and exposed it. That day was very bitter, the 16th and the 17th.
A lot of fathers and mothers perished. Children perished. So it was a community grabbed in grief. And that collective included Dr. Edelstein's family.
Dreadful feeling that Melville should have been killed. I feel very bad about it. And I didn't ever go into Soweto again after that. I couldn't bear the thought.
I was 12. It was 1 week before my bat mitzvah. It was very difficult because my father, having been such a religious man, had been looking so forward to this day. I decided to do it, to go ahead, and I'm pleased that I did it though. It's what he would have wanted, and it felt like I was doing it also in honor of who he was, you know, and then I was connecting more to him and on that day. I know that he was present, so it's comforting.
Oh no, no, life was never going to be the same after that. You know, that's the end of Happy Birthday. Forever. It's not dead. We lived very close to Alexander, so we were in it. It felt like an absolute whirlwind. It was like a nightmare.
I had two bosses, and I phoned them and said I had to go up to the funeral, and I told them what had happened. And then when I came back, they said, "Why didn't you tell us about your father?" And I said, "Well, because you're anti-Semitic." And this one in particular said, "I'm not anti-Semitic." And I said, "Oh, you are, you know, the Jewish jokes and all of that kind of thing." And it was a release and a relief. And that's when I stopped that stupid thing that I had of hiding the fact that I was half Jewish. I was tremendously proud of him.
The response of the regime was a determined effort to implicate the student leadership for the murder of Dr. Melville Edelstein, no matter what. In the process, students were arrested and tortured. Confessions were obtained under duress, and when tested, were easily exposed. Finally, 2 students, falsely accused, were brought to trial for the murder of Dr. Melville Edelstein. Found not guilty, they were acquitted. For no apparent reason and very much against her will, Rona was subpoenaed by the state to attend the trial. The defense was led by advocate George Bezos.
She was a lonely figure, sitting at the back, alone, looking very sad, hoping that the truth would come out.
I thought it was ridiculous, and after I saw who was being defended, the accused looked so young and vulnerable, it was ridiculous. I walked out because it was too ridiculous for words and very upsetting, and I went to the clerk of the court and I said, please don't subpoena me again because I will actually freak out and definitely not attend.
She shook her head from time to time when he heard the evidence of people who discredited the manner in which the confessions of the 2 people on trial were obtained. I felt for her.
With no individual conviction, how does history record the murder of Dr. Melville Edelstein?
A crowd returning from being witnesses to a cold-blooded murder of one of their number, in anger, as an act of revenge against what the police had done. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know that he was really their friend rather than enemy. And this is what happens when unjustified violence is used, particularly the police. I followed the TRC process. I was very impressed by the evidence given, particularly by the 2 daughters. I think that they were very brave.
Some 37 years on, Janet is married with 2 sons and a daughter. Following in her father's footsteps, Janet is very much involved in education. Here she facilitates a workshop with educators and coaches on difficulties experienced by teachers in the classroom situation in township schools.
The TRC for me is very important because in terms of the history of this country, I really felt that my father deserved a place. Not only in the history books, but within the Truth Commission. Just so it was noted who he was. He wasn't a freedom fighter, but he was fighting in another way.
Also present at the TRC hearings was student leader and activist Murphy Morobi. Testifying on the brutality of the security police and the torture and incarceration of students during the 1976 unrest, Murphy took the opportunity to meet and speak with Janet.
During the time of the Truth Commission, I had the privilege of getting to meet the family. And for me, I would say it's one of those cathartic moments that you go through. Actually, his death brought sharply to the fore the whole issue that we as South Africans have to fight unremittingly the scourge of racism, the scourge of seeing the other as something lesser than yourselves, and to believe that there is something in all of us that is good that we have to nurture. So when I met Janet in particular, you know, there was a sadness to the meeting on the one hand, but there was also a sense of accomplishment in having been able to meet someone who had lost so much out of an event in which I was one of the organizers.
I actually met with them, and it was good to meet with them. And I've met Murphy more than once, and when I see him now, I often bump into him. I am very happy to talk with him, and we seem to have a great rapport with one another.
And for Janet to be able to come across and open herself up, to my embrace at the time, it was absolutely a fulfilling experience, because it basically said that as we engage with being adults and going into the future, we're both going to be bringing up children who we had to share with the experiences that this country has gone through. I know that it could never bring back the father, but it is about a greater ideal. It's about cherishing the fact that it is possible, to go beyond the initial pain and still craft a future that is so much more hopeful for our own children going forward.
Some 37 years on, youngest daughter Shana is married with 3 sons and a daughter. Also in education, Shana runs a fashion design college in Johannesburg.
My son Levi was actually due on the 16th of June, but thank goodness for modern medicine. We made sure that wouldn't happen, but God had a better plan for me, and it didn't matter really what I did. He was born on the 9th of June, and he was brised on the 16th of June. And that day on the radio, people who were coming to the bris heard on the radio they were talking about the 16th. And I wonder what the Edelstein family is doing today. And that's what we were doing on that day, celebrating life. It's just so ironic, incredibly ironic.
I've thought about it long and hard over the years, and every year I reflect back and I just feel in some way it was meant to be. I don't understand it, but I do accept that that's what it was all about. It was just meant to be. Wrong place, wrong time. Fate.
I don't believe that he thought he's going to die, but could be from God, divine providence, that said, look, the time has come to find yourself as a Jew. I could see that he was in a journey, and how it can be all your life was worthwhile for the last day that a person makes the change for himself, returning back to God. So it could be very well that this was really what happened to him.
I can remember meeting Michael afterwards when he was already a qualified doctor. I happened to go to Boksburg Benoni Hospital, and he was, I think, might have been doing an internship there. And he seemed quite friendly. We spoke to one another, and I tried to invite him over. In fact, I did invite him over, but he wouldn't come. I said to him, you must come over and meet your family, but he wouldn't come.
Every anniversary of the day he was killed was a very lonely day for me, because no mention was made of the fact that he saw himself as part of the struggle against apartheid. And I didn't know what to do with anything I might have felt, because there was no one, there was nothing to say, nothing to do. So I never could get closure.
In Soweto today, heart of political tourism to South Africa, there is no shrine to Dr. Melville Edelstein, no mark of acknowledgement to his legacy or his contribution to the community of Soweto.
Mr. Edelstein, unfortunately, this is the place where his office was.
At 3940 Mputi Drive, on the corner of Malolo Street, today stands a refurbished Soweto home, at the site where Dr Melville Edelstein met his tragic and untimely death on June 16, 1976.
His name should be included among those that died in the situation to recognize a person like him, because he was part of the community and then he was part of the major objective in terms of the education of the black child. In one or the other, his name need to be remembered.
I think it would be important in some way, because then again it's bringing together everybody. I think it's that we all belong in that space, we're all part of it, so it is important for everybody to be included.
The legacy is very, very clear. Every child needs to be educated, and his role was to ensure that a black child in particular does get his education. And then the fact that he was playing a role that ensures that a child needs to remain in class or in school, that in itself is something that we need to uphold even today.